Hi guys, I'm Kristen. Welcome and welcome back. Today I want to share a few audiobook recommendations, and specifically I wanted to share books where I think that the reading experience is actually enhanced by listening to the audiobook. Now, I will be fully upfront in saying that I used to be one of those really judgmental people who was like, is audiobook reading like really reading? I definitely used to think that. I had no experience with audiobooks. For some reason I felt like the act of not seeing the words on the page and having to physically read that was somehow taking away from the reading experience. I will say that they are different experiences, but it was really getting back into reading a much larger quantity than I had been in my adult years, and actually experimenting with audiobooks that totally changed my mind on that opinion. To the extent that now I think there are books, and I want to share them with you, where I think it's better to read it as the audio. I think that it is a more fun, a more interesting experience where the narrator that has been chosen for that book has just done such a fabulous job that it brings the book that much more to life than it would if you were physically reading it with your eyes. I am coming into a time period where I plan to be doing the majority of my reading through audiobook just because it is so much more accessible. You can do it while you are out and about running errands, on your commute to work. And I think that people who really stick into that no, it's not really reading thing are using reading as a little bit of physically reading with your eyes as a little bit of gatekeeping for access to these stories. If listening to the audiobook allows you, if you are someone who has a schedule that does not permit you to sit down and fully divert all of your attention into that story in that moment, you might not be able to read as much as the other person, as other people who have more flexible schedules. So if you're someone who is super busy and listening to an audiobook allows you to fit reading and consuming these stories and supporting these authors and being immersed into that reading world, if audiobook listening gets you that, why wouldn't you do it? So today I'm going to be recommending 3 specific books where I think the audiobook actually enhances the reading experience, and I would highly recommend, consuming that book as an audiobook format. I do have one honorable mention as well. So I'm going to start off with that honorable mention, and that is The Ruin of Kings by Jen Lyons, or more specifically, the A Chorus of Dragons series at large. Instead of getting super into the plot and the synopsis and everything here, I will just direct you to my Who Should Read This or Should You Read This series video, because I think that is a more thorough job of introducing that. But this is a atypical fantasy series, and that it has a lot of classical fantasy setups and tropes, but it has a very unique narrative structure. And that narrative structure plays a large part of why the audiobook for this is so amazing, but why it is not great for only listening to audio is that it is really complicated and confusing. And so taking this story in as the first time, particularly with the first book, taking the story in as an audiobook, I think is an example of how fantasy world building can be really confusing to consume as audio. And so I don't actually think that listening to this as an audiobook for the first time is the best way to read this book. However, once you get into the series, I think that the audiobook only option does become a lot more approachable, as well as on rereads. This is an extremely rereadable series. There is so much more that you pick up and can read into on rereading. And in that way, once you've already dipped your toes into the world, you already have a better grasp on the world, then the audiobook is absolutely the route to go. I'm gonna put this down and I'm just gonna talk about the audiobook now. So this is a full cast narration story, which means that there are different voices depending on the perspective or the POV that we're getting at any given time. Why this is such a unique element and why it works so well for this series is that the narrative structure is really unique in this series. We are essentially being told a story from different POVs, or a couple different POVs, but really the book itself is this book that exists within the world that a particular character, or 2 actually particular characters within the series itself, have compiled this story. They've collected the various viewpoints and put them into this book for you, and they helpfully provide footnotes along the way if you don't quite understand something, or as the series progresses, just to share their opinion on events. So as you are reading or as you are listening to a particular perspective telling you this story, the footnote then in the audiobook version will have a different voice, a different narrator pop in and be like, oh, well, actually, the magic works in this way instead. Kieran is wrong here. Or they will help to confirm something, maybe something that happened earlier on in the series, a particular world element, a god thing. But anyway, so you'll be listening to the story from that perspective, and then suddenly a different voice will pop in with the footnotes. So again, honorable mention, really, really great audio experience, and where the listening to the audiobook does enhance the experience. But it is one of those fantasy series where it can be really, really difficult to take in the world building in this format alone. Okay, I had to open up my balcony door because it is absolutely outrageously humid, despite it not being that warm today. And I am like sweltering sitting here. So the door is open to get a little bit of cross breeze going on. I'm gonna try to power through this. And I hope there isn't too much background noise. I'm sorry, I just can't keep the door closed. So the first book that I actually want to recommend as a book, or in this case, particularly a novella, where I think the audiobook experience is going to be a better overall reading experience than it would as a physical or ebook read, is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Matar and Max Gladstone. I haven't talked about this one on my channel in a while, but I think it was one of my 2021, if I'm remembering correctly, favorites. I do obviously own a physical copy of this book as well, which I actually bought well after having listened to the audiobook. And I have to give a shout out to my friend Taylor, who got me to read this novella in the first place. So this is a sci-fi speculative story following two characters, Red and Blue, who are agents on opposing sides of this kind of futuristic time-traveling war. There is a lot of really interesting world components as these agents are traveling to different alternate timelines and different variations and alternates of the world to try to make small changes or impact events in that time period to progress their faction or their side of things in the future. And if that sounds confusing, it's totally okay. You know that I am not a huge sci-fi person in terms of world building, and I would say that all of the world building and interesting time traveling elements here is just colorful background elements to this beautiful and really, really interesting story where our agents Red and Blue begin communicating via letters, and even the letters themselves are not just handwritten notes. It's things that are so coolly integrated into the worlds, how they wind up communicating is so cool in and of itself. But Red and Blue begin communicating, initially taunting each other as they try to sabotage each other's plans. And over time, and we're talking a crazy amount of time, they begin to become each other's closest confidant and best friend, and then possibly more. And why this works so well as an audiobook is that our two narrators, who are Cynthia Farrell and Emily Wu Zeller, each voice Red and Blue. So for example, if you are in a Red chapter, it will be the narrator for whoever does Red's voice will be reading you in and setting the scene of how what's the world like here? What is Red doing here? Red's discovery of the letter. But then the letter that is obviously written by Blue is narrated by the narrator who does Blue's voice. And so it feels that much more intimate and personal while you're reading this letter from Blue or from Red in the alternate option there. Red and Blue, and the way that the two narrators do their voices is so distinctive as well. Of these two individuals, it definitely seems like one of the factions here is a little bit more robotical or mechanically inclined, and that actually does or is reflected in the voice and the narration. It's not a super robot-y voice, but the tone of voice, the intonation and things, the differences between Red and Blue, not only are they being voiced by someone else, but there's a particular almost mechanical robotic quality to that particular character that it's just so distinctive. And then hearing the letters actually being read out by a voice rather than reading them is there's just something about it that makes it so, so beautiful. Now, obviously I can't comment on the beauty of just the written word itself, as I haven't physically read that. That's the case in, I think, the remaining, all of the actually recommendations that I'm gonna make today, outside of Rune of Kings and the Course of Dragons series. But I can't imagine that the reading with your eyes experience alone is going to give you more of what you got out of that audio listening experience. So if you ever plan on picking up this novella, which I personally recommend, I do 1000% recommend listening to the audio. It is on Scribd as well if you have access to that. It is also only 4 hours on audiobook. I wouldn't speed this one up too much. If you are someone who does listen at a very fast rate, I would actually keep this like towards the 1 to 1.5 kind of times speed, 1.8 maybe. I think that going too quick here would ruin the beauty of it, and it's only 4 hours, so it's not like it's going to take terribly long either. The next book that I want to recommend that you listen to the audiobook instead of reading the physical is Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord, and this is narrated by Robin Miles. This is a retelling of a Senegalese folk tale that involves our main character, Pama, being given this gift that allows her to sort of control chaos. However, the previous the previous spirit that was the, holder of that chaos stick wants it back. And the story goes from there. One of the interesting things, again, with a different kind of narrative structure or framing here, is that we are being told this story by a very classic sitting around the fire kind of feel storyteller. So there is a little bit of that like breaking the fourth wall of this narrator who is telling you this story. And I think that in particular is why it makes such a great audiobook, because it feels like they're literally speaking to you. The story has a very like sticking to that kind of folktale narration. So don't go into this expecting like a retelling that you would think of now. Think of it as someone is kind of telling you this folklore story. So it is an interesting story. I do think it is best listened to in short bursts so that you can like really think about what each chapter or what each kind of story is giving you, because it is one of those books where it sort of introduces ideas and themes and concepts, but it doesn't break them down and spell it out for you. So I do think listen to this in short bursts. It is another short novella or a short audiobook. It's only 6 hours, but I think it was such an interesting and enhanced audio experience because of that storytelling element. And then the last audiobook recommendation that I'm going to make today, where a book that I think is going to be better as the audiobook than as reading it with your eyes, and that is Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. This is the first book in the Greatcoat series, although he does, or the same narrator, which is Joe Jameson, does narrate the entire series here. And this is often described as a swashbuckling good time, but I would say it's actually a very dark book that explores the idea of justice and a little bit of like sticking to your beliefs no matter what happens, through the good and the bad. And in this one, we are following our main character, Falcio. And Falcio used to be the leader of this band of swordsmen called the Greatcoats, who worked for the king and who traveled the lands to implement the laws and justice. However, the king was overthrown by the various dukes and duchesses within the realm. The Greatcoats got a bit of a bad name because they stood aside and let the king be essentially executed by the dukes and duchesses. We are following a group of three in particular, Falcio and two of his best friends, as they kind of get implicated for a murder. That's kind of the setup for the first book, but it goes much broader from there as they get woven into like conspiracies, as well as like this secret final mission from the king who set them on their path. But one of the reasons that this makes such a great audiobook experience is that it is first person, but it's also first person perspective, where the main character is breaking the fourth wall and talking to you, the reader. Now, I do think that in not only first-person perspective, but in particular first-person perspective, where they break the fourth wall and talk to you, the reader, is a narrative framing device that is always going to be really, really good in audio format, because it has that intimate, direct, talking to you feel, where you're listening in on the story, and then suddenly, like, maybe your attention is slipping and they directly speak to you and call you back in. Sometimes that can be a little bit jarring. I know that not everyone likes that particular framing device, and I think that I would say that it doesn't always read as well as it does when you are listening to it. Over the course of this book, we are getting some flashbacks. So not only is Falkio like telling us his story in the moment as we are going through the events, like in the current time frame with him. And then in addition to that, another, not trope, but another kind of framing device that is used here is that occasionally Falkio will stop the story to tell you a little something about a particular weapon or a particular city or something, or so like, now in order to, for this next part to make sense, you have to understand about this coat that I have, or now in order to understand like this next part, you have to learn, or I have to tell you about this sword that was made by this blacksmith that all of the great coats have, and the little like nifty tricks. So again, it's like breaking the fourth wall to tell you really quickly something about this thing. And I think that could be really disruptive when you're reading it with your eyes, but when you're listening to it as the audiobook, again, it like actually grabs your attention and pulls you back in. And I think that is something that sometimes when you are reading physically with your eyes, I think that breaks the flow of the story. But when you are listening to audiobooks, I actually find that those little breakout moments catch your attention again, and they pull you back in, because sometimes when you're listening to an audiobook, you are doing other stuff, and maybe you're not fully 100% engrossed in taking the story itself, depending on what you're doing. So those like breaking the fourth wall, let me bring you back in, oh wait, quick, here, I need to tell you about this thing, like catches your attention and draws you back into the story once more. And I feel like it's so effectively done, in particular in Traitor's Blade. I have actually read the second book, but I couldn't get access to the audiobook, so I did read the second book with my eyes. So I can only speak to the audiobook for the first one, even though it's the same narrator all throughout. So if you have been curious about picking up or starting the Greatcoat series, I would recommend trying it out first as an audiobook. This is ultimately a book or a series that is going to explore this idea of justice. It has a really, really great friendship group where there is some like lighthearted, fun moments, but it also gets super, super dark at times, and some very traumatic things happen to Falkio just in the first two books that I have read. So do know that going in, it does always get pitched as this like lighthearted, swashbuckling good time. And yes, there is a lot of that, but there's also some really horrifyingly traumatic experiences that you are also forced to read or listen to. So do know that going in, please. But if you are thinking about giving this book or this series a chance, try it as the audiobook, see if that works for you, and then go from there. Okay, that is the first round of audiobook recommendations that I'm going to make to you today, including of course, my beloved honorable mention of A Course of Dragons. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you read them as the physical, or if you've listened to the audiobook and you agree that it's better. And of course, always hit me up with your audiobook recommendations. I would love to hear what you are listening to these days. I will talk to you guys next time. Have a great day. Bye.